It closed at a time when lots of businesses closed, when lots of the business owners moved outward to other locations, or in this case, there was a wave of bank consolidations. Here's the Muddocks building, lodge and assembly halls upstairs. You can see the Masonic symbol right here. And downstairs, again, diversity of businesses has occupied this space. Perhaps the most infamous event that took place here was the first public gathering of the Ku Klux Klan in Sacramento in 1922. This event got a lot of coverage in the Sacramento Bee, and the city manager, Seavey, at that time threatened any employee of the city if their name appeared on the Ku Klux Klan roster. The Muddocks Annex was built a few years later, a few years after 1915, and it had for many years the Jenick and Scurfield canvas business, many decades occupying that site. So here's what the street looked like in 1959. Most of the business is occupied, but you see the automobile situation here. And in fact, the lack of parking was something that bothered the merchants significantly and gave an advantage to the new shopping centers like Fruit Ridge Manor that were being built at the edge of town at that point. So here's Gostick's Meat Market. It's right on Broadway. Many of you have probably driven by it. Ron Frolakis, the architect, has purchased this building, and we're hoping to see a new business occupy it. Next door is the Gostick House, and this is a theme that's repeated over and over again in Oak Park of business people owning a business and living very close by in Oak Park. So they had a high level of interest in the neighborhood because not only was it where they had their business, but it was also where they lived. Early churches include the Methodist Church, one of the earliest organized. This building dates from 1927. Because the Kyle's Temple Church is no longer adjacent to this church, it was actually moved to a location outside the walking tour area. I couldn't really include it, but I'm going to slip it in by the back door. So nearby was Kyle's Temple. It started life as an Episcopal church. In 1918, it was sold to Kyle's Temple African Methodist Episcopal Church, and the minister there was a really important African American leader. He helped found the Sacramento chapter of the NAACP, and he had what I think is one of the earliest racial discrimination lawsuits in Sacramento, which he sued a restaurant on 35th Street for refusing to serve him, and he won that court case. So a long time ago, long before Oak Park became largely African American. The church was sold to the Kyle's Temple in 1918. I'm not remembering exactly the lawsuit right now, but not too long, not too different from that. Elaine Crump, who's sitting in the front row with us tonight, reminded us that one of the attributes of Oak Park in the 1940s was that the behavior of children was lots of people's business. And the one time when she and her cousins dared to look into the 30-30 Club, they were reported to their grandmother and summarily chastised. So that's a set of images from the early Oak Park, and now I'm going to show you some things from the period of the largely from the period of the 1960s. While there are lots of decisions to disinvest from Oak Park, the U.S. Postal Service did something different, and they actually stayed in Oak Park on the traditional Main Street, and you can see here, built a new building dedicated to public service in 1968. But I think they were the exception, actually, rather than the rule. This was to support businessmen who were still hoping to stay in Oak Park, and indeed the federal government took that action. Some African-American businesses included Sebron Realty. George Sebron is the middle fellow on the right-hand side, and we're seeing him as part of the Sacramento Committee on Fair Housing in 1963. Fair housing was a very, very important issue, of course, at that time. California was a little bit ahead of the national curve on having fair housing legislation, meaning legislation that said you could not discriminate in terms of selling your property or renting your property to someone of a different race. And that law was passed, the Rumford Fair Housing Law, by the state legislature in 1963. By a vote of the people, it was overturned. Californians didn't like that. However, local African-American attorneys in Sacramento took it all the way to the California Supreme Court, and the vote of the people was overturned, and the Rumford Fair Housing Law was actually reinstated. George Sebron was very active in Democratic politics. He ran the Humphrey Muskie presidential campaign in Oak Park, and one of the campaigns of Governor Pat Brown. And he also, in addition to his realty, decided that he needed to open a second business in Oak Park to provide jobs for African-American youths, and also to bring fresh food, groceries to Oak Park. Now, this is an issue that has been with Oak Park for many, many, many decades. But here he was back in the 1960s attempting to meet that need. And the ad is kind of interesting in part because it shows the Southern cultural influence, I think, of his African-American customers. Robert Tyler also invested here. He was also an active in civil rights issues on the Human Rights Commission. Helped founded the National Association of Black Social Workers. The Belmonte Gallery. So here we see the coming in of the arts and culture segment of the economy and of society. So here is Salvador Iniguez. His widow, Masako, is with us tonight, and that is her pictured in the photograph on the right with a couple of Sac State students. And not only did he provide gallery space for people who went on to be extremely eminent artists, ceramicists and workers in glass and in the other arts, but he also gave space to liberal activist groups like the Congress on Racial Equality, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. He gave space to the McCarthy for President campaign. So they had both of those well represented in Oak Park, both Humphrey and McCarthy. Along the stretch of 35th Street was the local headquarters of the Black Panther Party for Self-Defense. And the picture that's partly obscured by the light here is a Sacramento picture. It wasn't taken on 35th Street. I believe it was probably taken at Sacramento City College. And the picture on the right, which is not in the archives collection, but it did appear in the Sacramento Bee, is the one picture that I've seen of the front of the Black Panther office there along 35th. This is an issue of the Panther newspaper. I alluded to the Father's Day disruption incident, disturbance, I think is what the Sacramento Observer referred to it as, where there were lots of African Americans out in the street and out in McClatchy Park. The police came by. There were verbal taunts apparently on both sides. More police arrived, and eventually the police ended up shooting into the Black Panther Party headquarters, both bullets and also tear gas, and the party headquarters was trashed. Now, perhaps even more significant, a more significant incident happened the following year in Oak Park. A white policeman was killed, and a number of African American youths with connections, either members or supporters of the Black Panther Party, were arrested for that crime. And 7 were initially arrested, then it went down to 5, then it went down to 4, and eventually they were all exonerated. But this case went on for months, and its treatment in the Observer and in the Sacramento Bee was quite different. And I think it really made clear the different perceptions of particularly police behavior between whites and blacks. Not that everybody in both those groups had the same point of view, but I think it was very clear that there was a significant overall racial divide on this incident and on the police relationship with African Americans. So it was a very important, painful, difficult couple of years. The fire station. This is, I put this here rather than earlier, although this dates from the 1915 time period, but this was the possible perch, the tower, for the shooting of the policeman. And this is a folk memory that many people will bring forward if you are pausing to look at this building. I've had more than one person come up and tell me the story of the tower, even though even that is not an established fact. One of the very interesting things that came out of the Black Power movement in Sacramento was the establishment of black student unions at many of the colleges and high schools in Sacramento in the early 1970s. And particularly active was the one at Sacramento City College. And they actually had an outreach center in Hope Park for a couple of years, and it was when they weren't using this for classes in Black Studies, it was a really important place for neighborhood organization, including support for the Oak Park for the 4 men who were arrested for the shooting of the policeman and kept in jail for many months. So an important community space. The Sacramento Observer did not begin life in Oak Park, but it did move here. It is now on the edge of Oak Park. It's no longer in the building on the right, which is currently a church, but it has deep roots here, and it's important to remember that that is the spot that they occupied for several decades. That is the most important black medium in Sacramento. The house up there on the right-hand corner of the slide belonged to Jimmy Long. He and his sister were both attorneys, and they're pictured here in 1978, and he was among those who defended the Oak Park 4 in that court case successfully. And he, just 4 years after this photograph was taken, was appointed as a judge. But he had his private law practice prior to that on 35th Street in Oak Park and lived right around the corner. So we have some more contemporary examples of that living and working in the neighborhood and making it, therefore, especially a place where one's energies are invested. The Steen residence was very close to Steen's Corner. Oops, sorry about that. And this was the oldest business in Oak Park, oldest surviving business until it closed in 1969. And it was the place where you stopped to get a drink before you went to have joy in Joyland, because there was no alcohol enjoyment. So they did very well by that and managed to survive even Prohibition and made it until June 1969. So this was one of the businesses that closed immediately after the Father's Day incident in Oak Park. And the building was later, the bar was later torn down, but the house is still there, associated with the Steen family.